Hey guys, this is part 5 of Yamato vs. Iowa. This will be the conclusions video, in which I'll be taking the information which I told you from the past 4.5 videos and putting them into one and telling you what I think. Now, you're free to make your own conclusions from what I told you so far, but keep in mind that this video will mostly be subjective, but the past 4.5 were just pure fact. So, I will start with machinery, and a footnote, by the way. So the speed difference in the maximum speeds between Iowa and Yamato wasn't 6 knots. It wasn't even 4 knots. It was actually 3 knots. I'll explain. So the maximum speed of Yamato, as I told you before, was 28 knots. Like, she reached 28 knots. It's normally said to be 27 knots, but it was actually 28 knots, told to us by a former crew member of Yamato who actually served on her. The top speed of Iowa is normally given at 33 knots, but she never actually reached 33 knots either. Most sources give her maximum reach speed as 32.5 knots, but that's also false. The maximum speed she actually achieved was 31 knots in pursuit of Noaki during Operation Hailstorm. And another interesting thing that I heard from a friend of mine was that she couldn't fire Iowa couldn't fire over her bow, which is weird considering that she had super firing turrets on her forward half of her superstructure. But apparently she couldn't fire over her bow, and there actually is evidence to support this. What you're seeing now is the radar plot from the Battle of Trartalgoon, or the attack on Trartalgoon by US forces, and this is what the path that Iowa took in her pursuit of Noaki. And what it shows is that she was kind of like crossing Noaki's T, but from behind, which is kind of weird, but basically it shows that either for some reason she didn't choose to go directly after Noaki. Now that could be just because her captain wanted to face all of her guns at Noaki at the same time, but it could also be because she couldn't actually fire over her bow, which would actually make her really vulnerable to having her T crossed by enemy warships, namely Yamato, or any other battleship really. Because if you can't fire over your bow, you're gonna be kind of screwed if your enemy crosses your T. It could have been for structural reasons, maybe like her bow couldn't handle the stress of all six forward guns firing at the same time. I don't know, but for some reason that wasn't a possibility. Maybe it was because she was moving and like the force would jolt her or something. But anyway, the radar plot also shows that her maximum achieved speed wasn't 32.5 knots, but was rather 31 knots. It says like right there, her speed at the time was 31 knots. Which brings down her speed difference between Iowa and Yamato to 3 knots and not 6 knots. That's like half. That's like half of the difference. So next was anti-submarine warfare capability and anti-aircraft gunnery. As for anti-submarine warfare, of course they mostly relied on their escort and destroyers and cruisers for defense against submarines and aircraft. But of course they were armed with observation and scouting planes, which are really designed for use as aerial spotting, for gunfire and for fire control. But still, they were capable, I guess, in a limited role as anti-submarine warfare equipped planes, and they would just carry depth charges for use against enemy submarines. Of course, their use would have been limited, but I guess Yamato would have been slightly superior as an anti-submarine warfare platform. Of course, they would both pretty much suck, but she carried more planes. She carried 7 planes versus Iowa's 4 planes, and her planes were a bit more longer range, but it's a moot point really, because no one's gonna use a battleship's planes as anti-submarine warfare planes unless you're really, really in a tight spot. Now, anti-aircraft is where it gets interesting, because most aircraft kills that the US got during the war was from Combat Air Patrol, or CAP, and that was the case for most air forces, even Japan. Well, obviously Japan. But anyway, the Iowa class's anti-aircraft defense wasn't that great, because case in point was when I believe during the Battle of Okinawa, a lone kamikaze plane, I believe it was a dive bomber, dived at Missouri, and it was just one plane. Dived at Missouri through the clouds, and in spite of her radar and her anti-aircraft guns, the plane still made it through the anti-aircraft guns. I don't think it was like detected by the radar until it was like 5 kilometers away. I'm not sure about that part. But anyway, in spite of her guns, it still made it through the anti-aircraft defense. No, it wasn't a dive bomber. It was a Zero. A Zero, which was, you know, infamous for breaking up and burning up after like one shot to the fuel tanks, which were everywhere, and the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks, still made it through the Missouri's AA defense and scored a hit. Of course, it wasn't a damaging hit, but it was still a hit, like as in the plane made contact with the ship in spite of several barrages of anti-aircraft fire, which is even a worse record than what Yamato had during her Tengo Satsen, Operation Tengo. So there's that, although it's mostly an imprecise science, you know, determining whether or not, you know, Iowa or Yamato would have been more successful as AA platforms. Well, there's the fact that Iowa was faster, but the fact that Yamato was a better turner, more maneuverable, which meant that she would have been able to turn if a torpedo was heading toward her better than Iowa could. Next is the most contended issue of the Iowa versus Yamato topic, fire control. I've gone over in part 2, something I skimmed over before, but from the evidence that we have as of now, historically, Yamato had a superior record of fire control compared to Iowa. Iowa scored 2 hits out of around 86 main battery rounds, 46 against 46 against Katori, and 40 against Noagi, which comes from the radar plot, which I believe it was 5 8-round salvos from her main battery, and the longest range at which she could have fired and scored a hit upon an enemy surface combatant vessel was around 17,000 yards, or around 16,000 meters. Compared to that, Yamato scored around at least 5, maybe 6, but probably around 4 or 5 hits against enemy surface warships, and the maximum range at which she was known to have scored a hit, a confirmed hit, was 32,000 meters, give or take, maybe 1 kilometer, which is around twice the range at which Iowa could have hit an enemy warship, which was the light cruiser Katori. Only 2 hits. That's like, I don't know, twice the number of hits with a bit more overall number of shots, which means that Yamato historically had a much better FC system than Iowa. It's gonna be hard to take, but it's true. Now, part of this myth of superior US radar-based fire control comes from the actions of Washington at the night battle of Guadalcanal in 1942. But people forget that she scored her hits at like point-blank range, 7,000 meters. No, 7,000 yards. That's even less in meters. That's like right up close for a battleship versus battleship battle. Kind of hard to say, but and the fact that at the Battle of Surigao Strait, the U.S. battleships were crossing the Japanese battleship's T, which were hardly taking any evasive action because of our captain, and the fact that the range was again really short. But those aren't even the battleships that we are concerned about. We are concerned about the Iowa class against the Yamato class, and in this respect, the Yamato class had a much superior fire control system, at least record, compared to the Iowa class. And no, Iowa would not have been able to lob shells over the horizon with impunity, because her radar was not capable of that, and neither was her FC system, clearly. Last main point is armor and guns. Although it's true that the Japanese armor, the new Vickers non-cemented, had a much had a bit lower metal quality because of the amount of resources available to the Japanese Navy at the time, the sheer amount and the pretty small difference in quality was enough that Yamato was much better protected against both plunge-in fire and direct fire against her armored belt compared to Iowa, and that Iowa's decapping plate was either a myth or completely ineffective, as seen from what South Dakota or Sodak faced when she was shot at by Japanese heavy cruisers, and Kirishima. As for guns, Yamato's guns were longer range, but that's irrelevant, had better penetration, and more importantly had a much larger bursting charge, which meant that if she were to hit and pierce through the armor on Iowa, and vice versa, the explosion caused by Yamato's shell would be much more dangerous, much more powerful compared to the explosion caused by Iowa's shell, due to the difference in the quality and the explosive volatileness of the filler itself and the sheer amount. Footnote on the Type 91 shells that were used by the main batteries on board Yamato. The designers behind the shell intended the shell to have a controlled underwater trajectory, which meant that if the shell were to land a bit short of the enemy warship, it would dive into the water and it would keep going straight and hit the battleship underwater. Now, of course, this meant that if the shell were to land in the water, it was much superior to what would happen if a US shell, or a German shell, or a British shell hit the water. But when it didn't hit the water, it kind of reduced the performance. And one more side effect was that the fuse on board the shells, the Type 91 shells, was 0.4 seconds. That's literally 10 times the fuse length of any other country's fuse. Now, of course, this meant that it was effective against heavily armored warships, but against destroyers or cruisers, it would punch right through the armor and then through the other side before exploding, which kind of accounts for the poor performance of the center force at the Battle of Samar in 1944 against the lightly armored heavy cruiser escort carriers and destroyers. That's a little footnote. And so my opinion from the plethora of information that I've gathered and presented to you over these past few videos is that Yamato was far superior to Iowa in a 1v1 role as a battleship, a ship of the line that would engage other ships of the line in direct combat. Granted, of course, that Iowa was a superior escort, which was what the battleships ended up doing in the end. She was faster, although by a few knots, less maneuverable, but that's not too important, and she was a much less of a fuel guzzler. And so she was a lot cheaper to maintain than Yamato and her sister ship, which I believe could use up to 70 tons of fuel oil per hour at maximum speed, 28 knots. So this was my series on Yamato versus Iowa. This should be the last video, unless I might have a few more extra bits and pieces at the end that I might add later on. But except for that, this is the end. So thank you for watching these past few episodes, and over the course of 6 months, because I'm a lazy bastard. But thank you for watching, and until next time, see you later. Bye.